I'm going to show you a history book that I really enjoyed. I won't go as far as to say it was my favourite history book of all time, but I will say it was very good, and I was very surprised when I read it. It is Warsaw 1920. It's by Adam Zamoyski, and it's got the subtitle Lenin's Failed Conquest of Europe. Now, this is probably a book you've not read, or probably a book or battle you've never even heard of. And I think that's the point. That's why I've made this video. Let me just explain this. Let me read some of the first paragraphs of this book. And Adam, if you are watching this, I'm only going to read a few lines. It's not that dramatic. It may come as something of a surprise to most people that a battle as decisive as Marathon or Waterloo took place in Europe between the end of the First World War in 1918 and the outbreak of the Second in 1939. Dramatic and fateful as they were, the events that took place at the gates of Warsaw in August 1920 have sunk into oblivion. This is the more surprising as they had a profound effect on the politics of the 1920s and 1930s, on the course of the Second World War, and on the peace settlement of 1945, as well as a lasting one on attitudes throughout Europe. Figures such as Stalin, Churchill, and de Gaulle were personally involved, while others, such as Mussolini, Franco and Hitler, took careful note. The reasons for this eclipse are not hard to find. One is that while the battle did indeed alter the course of history, it did so by preventing something from taking place rather than by reversing it. This meant that it had no palpable impact on anyone not directly involved. Basically, if the battle had been the other way around, world history would have changed dramatically. The communists would have been at the Maginot Line in 1920 or 21, and the whole of Eastern and Central Europe would have been under Lenin's control. The Iron Curtain would have been 20 years ahead of its time. Communism would have spread outside of one country, as it didn't do, and it would have spread further, and figures like Stalin and whatever would have had to have taken a different course of history, probably. It may have resulted in a Second World War in the 1920s rather than the 1940s. And there's probably a myriad of other reasons why this would have been bad. And yet, you've probably never heard or even read this book, or heard of the battle, or read about the war. And it makes you wonder. I mean, it makes me wonder. How many battles, how many wars, how many campaigns have been fought that we've never heard of, that could have altered the course of history in such a dramatic way? I mean, this is one example of probably many that are out there. This is the only book I've seen in the shops about this particular battle or this particular war. I mean, there are ones in the Russian Revolution, but I mean, this is quite specific. It's certainly not a very well-known battle, and that's kind of, or at least outside of Poland, and that's kind of weird. So a battle that could have altered the course of history as we know it, very dramatically, is unknown. It's completely unknown. It just proves that if something doesn't sell, or an author isn't interested in it, then you've never heard of it. All the battles, all the wars, all the campaigns that you have heard of, you have read, all those ones behind me, are all because people took an interest in those particular battles, campaigns, individuals, whatever, and ignored a lot of others. World-changing events have been forgotten, neglected, or just sit idly by, waiting for someone to go and find them. Or maybe it's nationalism, you know, the British haven't heard of Poland in 1920 because they're not interested, they weren't involved. Maybe the Americans aren't either, but the Poles probably are, right? You guys probably will love this book because, you know, it's your national history and all that. Maybe the Russians maybe have a bit of an interest in it, and then everyone else forgets about it, because why not? You know, it didn't change. You know, if the Poles had lost, well, I think everyone would have heard about it then, but because they won, yeah, nobody cares. Well, actually, I do care, because I think this is something you guys should read. If you haven't read this book, go out and buy it. It's actually very interesting. The whole book it's only thin, but it's really good all the way through. Loved it, read it cover to cover, no problem. And I guess it's time for you guys to tell me what battles, campaigns, history, individuals, whatever, that you've heard of, that I probably haven't heard of, most people haven't heard of, that probably could have, or maybe should have, changed the course of history dramatically. I mean, there's got to be hundreds of battles, there's got to be thousands of individuals, there's got to be events galore that we probably haven't heard of, that we probably should have heard of. And I think it's kind of tragic, to be honest, that we haven't heard of these, or they're not as popular, they don't sell books. They shouldn't be forgotten. They should continue, they should remain. We should have heard of them. Or at least, even in passing. And yet we haven't.